The sky was still dark when Ethan Montgomery slipped out of bed, careful not to wake anyone in the small, modest house. His parents were still asleep, exhausted from the long hours they'd worked the day before. The only sound in the house was the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway and the occasional rustling of the wind outside. Ethan had grown used to the early mornings. His parents had always struggled to make ends meet, and he'd taken it upon himself to help as much as he could. Ethan wasn't an extraordinary student or athlete, but he was good with his hands and determined to work hard. Every morning, before the rest of the world stirred, he rode his bicycle through the sleepy streets of the town, delivering newspapers to the neighborhood's quiet homes. He had a route to finish, but he didn't mind. This early, before anyone was awake to notice, Ethan could just be alone with his thoughts. He pulled on a worn hoodie, grabbed his backpack full of folded papers, and quietly stepped out the back door. The cold air bit at his face as he pedaled down the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalks. The crispness of the morning always made him feel alive, despite the exhaustion in his muscles. The rhythmic sound of his tires on the pavement was a comforting background noise, a reminder that he had done this countless times before. He passed the familiar houses, each one different but equally still in the quiet morning light. The sprawling Victorian homes on one end of the street always reminded him of something out of a history book, large, with tall windows and ivy crawling up the sides. His bicycle's tires crunched over the occasional fallen leaf, the sound sharp against the calm of the dawn. Ethan's route took him past the Fitzgerald house, a dilapidated place on the corner of Oakwood and Elm. Mr. Fitzgerald had lived there for as long as Ethan could remember. The house was a relic of another time, once grand, now with peeling paint, broken windows, and a roof that sagged like a tired old man. But Mr. Fitzgerald, despite his age, had always kept to himself. The neighbors rarely saw him, but when they did, they always commented on how he seemed to grow thinner and quieter with each passing year. The house was always the last stop on his route. Ethan would toss the paper to the doorstep with a flick of his wrist, making sure it landed on the mat, even if he didn't get a thank you. He didn't expect one. Most of the residents in the neighborhood were older folks who had little to do with the younger generation. Ethan had gotten used to the isolation that came with his task. But there was something about the Fitzgerald house that had always intrigued him. Maybe it was the mystery of the place, or the quiet sadness that hung in the air around it. But this morning, something was different. As Ethan neared the Fitzgerald house, he saw a faint flicker of light through the crack in the door. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the early morning light, but as he pedaled closer, he realized that the door was slightly ajar. That was strange. Mr. Fitzgerald was always inside early, but he never left the door open. And certainly, it wasn't the sort of house you left unlocked at this hour. Ethan slowed down, instinctively glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. But the streets were still empty. The only sounds were the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He stopped his bike in front of the Fitzgerald house, his heart thumping louder than the ticking of the clock inside the house. The door was wide enough now for Ethan to see inside. The living room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, and the clutter from years of neglect seemed more pronounced in the weak light. But it wasn't the clutter that made his chest tighten. It was the figure standing inside the doorway, leaning against the doorframe. Mr. Fitzgerald was there, but something was wrong. The elderly man's frail form barely held itself upright. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his breathing was shallow. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now seemed distant, unfocused. The man was swaying slightly, as if he were trying to keep himself from falling. His hands gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white against the dark wood. "Mr. Fitzgerald?" Ethan called out, his voice tentative, unsure. The old man didn't respond at first. His eyes slowly shifted toward Ethan, but they didn't seem to register him. Ethan's stomach churned with a sudden gnawing fear. This wasn't just the usual morning routine. Something was terribly wrong. "Mr. Fitzgerald?" Ethan repeated, this time louder, taking a step closer. "Are you okay?" The elderly man's lips parted, but the words that came out were barely a whisper, unintelligible. Ethan's pulse quickened, and without thinking, he hopped off his bike and walked toward the house, his senses on high alert. As he reached the porch, a wave of foul air hit him, thick with the smell of something stale and sour. The door creaked in protest as it swayed gently in the wind. Ethan could see the old man's chest rise and fall unevenly, his breathing ragged. The moment stretched out. Ethan's mind raced. Should he call someone? Should he do something? But before he could make a decision, Mr. Fitzgerald's body slumped further, and he let out a small, wheezing gasp, almost like a final, desperate sigh. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He couldn't stand there and do nothing. He quickly grabbed his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling as he dialed the emergency number. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice answered. Ethan took a deep breath. It's Mr. Fitzgerald. I think he's in trouble. He's not breathing right. He looks really sick, and I don't think he can stand up. The dispatcher didn't hesitate. We'll send help right away. Stay with him until the paramedics arrive, and don't try to move him. Ethan nodded, though he knew the dispatcher couldn't see him. He stayed close to the old man, his heart pounding in his chest. A heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the faint hum of the distant traffic. As he waited for help, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. Was this his responsibility? He had never been this close to a real emergency before. Ethan had always been someone who stayed in the background, someone who helped when needed, but never stepped forward too much. But now, standing in front of Mr. Fitzgerald's fragile form, he realized that doing nothing wasn't an option. And so, he waited, unsure of what would happen next, but certain of one thing. His world had already begun to shift. Ethan stood there, his heart racing, as he tried to keep Mr. Fitzgerald conscious. The old man was still swaying in the doorway, barely holding on. Ethan reached out a hand, unsure of how to help without making things worse. The air around them felt thick with tension, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. His mind was spinning. He had never been in a situation like this before. Sure, he'd patched up a scraped knee or helped a neighbor carry groceries, but this was different. Mr. Fitzgerald was elderly and frail, and Ethan could see that something was terribly wrong. The man wasn't just sick, it was as though his very life was slipping away, piece by piece. As he waited for the paramedics to arrive, Ethan tried to keep the panic at bay. He stayed by the door, glancing out at the street to make sure help was coming. The minutes felt like hours, each one stretching longer than the last. The distant hum of traffic seemed to fade into the background, and all Ethan could focus on was the sound of Mr. Fitzgerald's labored breathing. You're going to be okay, Ethan muttered under his breath, even though he wasn't sure if he believed it. He didn't know if the old man could even hear him. The seconds crawled by as Ethan remained at Mr. Fitzgerald's side. The once vibrant man, who had lived alone in this house for as long as Ethan could remember, now seemed so fragile, so distant. Ethan's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? The house had always been a place of mystery for him, the crumbling facade hiding more than just peeling paint and forgotten furniture. But now, standing there with the old man, he realized just how little he truly knew about him. It wasn't just the house that had always intrigued Ethan. It was Mr. Fitzgerald himself. A man who seemed to carry the weight of years without ever letting it show. There were whispers in the neighborhood about his past, rumors about a fortune he'd once had, about a family he'd lost. But no one ever talked to him directly. He was a figure in the background of everyone's lives, a quiet presence that no one ever fully understood. But now, as Ethan watched the man struggle to stay conscious, all those thoughts seemed irrelevant. All that mattered was getting him help. Ethan felt a deep sense of urgency, a desire to fix something that he wasn't sure how to fix. He was just a kid, after all. He didn't have the skills or the knowledge to save someone. All he could do was wait and hope that someone who did would arrive soon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens pierced the stillness of the morning air. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he stepped away from the door, glancing up the street. The ambulance was coming, its lights flashing red and blue against the quiet backdrop of the neighborhood. Within moments, the paramedics were there. Two of them rushed to the door, their hands moving quickly as they assessed Mr. Fitzgerald's condition. Ethan stepped back, his hands shaking as he watched the professionals take over. They seemed so calm, so focused, as they checked the old man's pulse and began hooking him up to equipment. It was a relief to know that help had finally arrived, but a part of Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Something deeper than just a medical emergency. The paramedics worked quickly, but Ethan couldn't help but notice the grim expressions on their faces as they moved Mr. Fitzgerald onto a stretcher. It was clear that this wasn't a routine call. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach, as if he knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end well. One of the paramedics, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, turned to Ethan as she loaded Mr. Fitzgerald into the ambulance. "You did the right thing by calling us," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But we need to get him to the hospital right away. I'm not sure he's going to make it." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I didn't know what to do. He just collapsed." The woman gave him a sympathetic look. "You did what you could. That's all anyone can ask for." Ethan stood there, watching as the ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing in the distance. His mind was a blur of confusion and concern. He couldn't shake the image of Mr. Fitzgerald's frail body, barely holding on to life. What had happened to the old man? Was this just some kind of freak accident? Or was there something more to it? The questions lingered in Ethan's mind as he stood there on the empty street. He had never thought much about Mr. Fitzgerald before today. He had always just been the strange, reclusive man at the end of the block. But now, in the wake of the crisis, Ethan felt an odd sense of connection to him. He couldn't explain it, but something about the man's vulnerability had touched him deeply. As he turned to get back on his bike, Ethan caught sight of something strange in the distance. A black car was parked a few houses down, its tinted windows reflecting the light of the rising sun. It was a sleek, expensive vehicle that didn't quite belong in this neighborhood. Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease as he looked at it. Why was it there? And why had it been parked so close to the Fitzgerald house? Shaking off the feeling, Ethan tried to focus on the task at hand. He still had a route to finish, but the events of that morning had shaken him to his core. Something about Mr. Fitzgerald's condition, the ambulance, and the mysterious car made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. As he continued down the street, the weight of the morning's events still clung to him. But one thing was certain: he would never look at his quiet neighborhood the same way again. As Ethan pedaled away from the Fitzgerald house, the unsettling feeling about the black car lingered in the back of his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how out of place it had seemed. No one around here drove such expensive, sleek cars. The neighborhood was modest, filled with working-class families, and the few luxury vehicles that occasionally appeared always felt like they didn't belong. But Ethan didn't have time to dwell on it. He had a job to finish, delivering newspapers. His routine was simple, his thoughts always occupied by the next house, the next driveway. But today was different. His mind was buzzing with the strange events surrounding Mr. Fitzgerald. By the time Ethan had finished his route, the feeling of unease had not left him. Instead, it had grown. He couldn't shake the image of the paramedics loading Mr. Fitzgerald into the ambulance, the grim look on their faces, and the strange black car sitting on the corner. It didn't sit right. And Ethan's instincts were telling him that something bigger was at play. He dropped off the last of the newspapers at the street corner and made his way back to his bike. But as he turned the corner toward his house, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. The black car was there again. It was parked at the same spot, just a few houses down from his own. And the engine was running. The car's windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Ethan's heart raced, his pulse quickening as his curiosity got the better of him. He knew he shouldn't get involved, that it wasn't his business, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He parked his bike a few houses down from the car, hiding behind a tall hedge to get a better look. From his vantage point, he could just make out the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to be paying attention to the world around them. Ethan tried to steady his breathing, wondering what they were doing. Had they been watching Mr. Fitzgerald's house too? Minutes passed, but the car remained there, parked on the street as if waiting for something or someone. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Could this person be involved with what had happened to Mr. Fitzgerald? Was the old man's collapse somehow connected to this mysterious car? And why had it been parked so close to his house? Before Ethan could think of an answer, the car's engine roared to life. It was as if the driver had been waiting for a signal or for something to happen. Slowly, the black car pulled away from the curb, its tires screeching slightly as it drove off in the direction of the hospital. Ethan's stomach tightened. There was no way this was a coincidence. The car had been waiting there, and now it was heading straight toward the place where Mr. Fitzgerald had been rushed. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as the mystery deepened, pulling him in. He needed answers, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. As the car disappeared around the corner, Ethan reluctantly pulled out his phone and sent a text to his friend, Jake. Jake was the type of person who loved a good mystery, and Ethan knew that if there was anyone who would be willing to investigate this with him, it was Jake. The text was simple. Jake, something weird is going on with Mr. Fitzgerald. I need your help. Meet me at the park in 15 minutes. Jake's reply came almost immediately. You've got me intrigued. I'm in. With a deep breath, Ethan headed to the park, his mind racing. He needed to know what was going on. Was Mr. Fitzgerald's collapse really just an accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? The black car, the mysterious driver, and the strange connection to Mr. Fitzgerald, it all pointed to something bigger, something Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. When he arrived at the park, Jake was already waiting by the swings, his usual grin stretched across his face. But when he saw the look on Ethan's face, the smile faded. Okay, man, what's going on? Jake asked, his voice low. You look like you just saw a ghost. I don't know how to explain it, but something's not right, Ethan began, recounting the events of the morning, from Mr. Fitzgerald's sudden collapse to the black car parked outside his house. As he spoke, Jake's expression grew more serious, and by the time Ethan finished telling the story, his friend was already on edge. You think this has something to do with Fitzgerald? Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Like he's connected to that car? I don't know, Ethan replied, feeling the weight of his uncertainty. But it's too much of a coincidence. That car showed up right after the ambulance left, and it was parked too close to the house. Jake scratched his head, his brow furrowed. All right, so what do we do now? We can't just go up to the hospital and ask questions, and we don't even know who owns that car. Ethan nodded, frustrated. He hadn't thought of that. They couldn't exactly walk into a hospital and demand answers about a patient's condition, especially not someone as private as Mr. Fitzgerald. But Jake's voice broke through his thoughts. You know, he said slowly, there is one thing we can try. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What's that? Mr. Fitzgerald might have a record at the local library, Jake said. I've seen him there a few times, checking out books. Maybe we can find out more about him. Maybe even find out if he's been involved with anyone suspicious. Ethan thought about it for a moment. It was a long shot, but it might be their only lead. If there was anything about Mr. Fitzgerald's past that could explain what was happening now, it was worth a try. All right, Ethan said, determination hardening in his voice. Let's go to the library. Ethan and Jake made their way through the quiet streets toward the local library. The early afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Their minds were racing with possibilities, each one more thrilling and unsettling than the last. If there was even the slightest chance that Mr. Fitzgerald's collapse was connected to something darker, they had to find out. And the library, of all places, might hold the answers. The library was a small, humble building nestled between two older homes. Its brick facade looked like it belonged to another time, and the oak doors creaked as Ethan pushed them open. The familiar scent of old books greeted them as they stepped inside, the quiet hum of the air conditioner filling the space. The soft murmur of the librarian sorting through paperwork was the only sound that broke the silence. Jake glanced around, his eyes scanning the rows of shelves filled with dusty tomes. So, where do we start? He whispered, his voice barely audible in the calm surroundings. Ethan took a deep breath. I don't know, but let's look for any records. Any articles or books on Fitzgerald, his history, anything that might give us a clue about who he really is. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, looked up as they approached the front desk. Her glasses perched low on her nose. She gave them a polite smile, but didn't say anything, seemingly content to let them browse on their own. Ethan and Jake headed toward the back, where old newspapers were stored in metal cabinets and where local records were kept. They started scanning through the rows of filing cabinets, pulling out newspapers from the last few months. As Ethan flipped through the pages, his heart raced. There was nothing unusual at first, just local news, weather reports, and advertisements. But then he found something. It was a small article buried near the back of a local paper dated a few weeks before. The headline read, "Mysterious Business Tycoon Spotted in Town." Ethan's fingers froze on the page. The article was brief, mentioning that a wealthy businessman from out of state had been seen around town recently, meeting with local officials. There was no mention of Mr. Fitzgerald's name, but the description of the man, tall, well-dressed, with a stern demeanor, struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. This had to be the same person. The article didn't provide much detail, but it mentioned that the businessman was connected to a real estate company that was buying up properties around town. Jake leaned over Ethan's shoulder and read the article with a frown. This could be it. Maybe Mr. Fitzgerald is more than just an old man with a garden. What if he's connected to this guy? Or maybe this businessman is tied to the black car. Ethan didn't know what to think. His head spun with the new revelation. The businessman could very well be the person behind the mysterious car. But what was the connection to Mr. Fitzgerald? Why had he collapsed that morning? Was it all some elaborate scheme? Or was there something more to it? He quickly scanned the rest of the article, his eyes landing on a crucial piece of information. "There's more," he said, almost to himself. "It says here that this businessman's company has been involved in land acquisitions across the county, and it mentions something about a property deal near Fitzgerald's neighborhood." Jake's eyebrows shot up. That sounds like it could be the motive. If Mr. Fitzgerald owns property or land in the area, maybe this businessman wants it. Maybe that's why Fitzgerald collapsed. Maybe he's being pushed out. Ethan's stomach twisted. It made too much sense. If Mr. Fitzgerald was somehow involved in this shady real estate deal, it would explain a lot. Perhaps the black car was linked to the businessman, keeping an eye on Fitzgerald and the neighborhood. But what did it all mean for Ethan? And why was he so deeply involved in this? He hadn't asked for any of this. With renewed determination, Ethan skimmed through more records, hoping to uncover something else that could shed light on the situation. But it was Jake who found something unexpected. "Ethan, look at this," Jake said, holding up an old, yellowed file. It was a property deed. "It's for land right next to Fitzgerald's house. It looks like it was transferred only a few months ago." Ethan took the file from Jake, his pulse quickening as he read the details. The deed listed Mr. Fitzgerald's name as the original owner, but the new buyer was listed as a holding company with a vague name. It didn't seem to make much sense at first, but then something caught his eye. The name of the company's president was none other than the businessman from the article, the same one who had been spotted in town recently. Ethan's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mr. Fitzgerald had been caught in the middle of a land deal, and the businessman had been using his influence to push him out of the picture. No wonder Mr. Fitzgerald had been acting so strange lately. Ethan's mind raced, trying to figure out what this meant for him, for Jake, and for the entire neighborhood. "We need to find out more about this company," Ethan said urgently, already feeling the weight of the situation. "We need to get to the bottom of this before it's too late." Jake nodded. "Agreed. But how do we get more information without raising suspicion?" Ethan thought for a moment. "We could go to the company's office, see what we can dig up. Maybe someone there knows something, or at least we can get some insight into what they're up to." Jake hesitated. "That's risky. We don't know what kind of people we're dealing with. But I guess if we want answers, we're going to have to take a chance." Ethan's eyes narrowed with resolve. "We don't have a choice. We have to stop whatever is going on before it spirals out of control." They both turned back to the librarian, who had been quietly observing them from the front desk. Ethan's voice was steady as he said, "Thanks for your help. We've found what we needed." As they exited the library, the weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air. The black car, the businessman, the mysterious land deals, it was all starting to come together. But they were no closer to understanding the full extent of the conspiracy that was unfolding right under their noses. The stakes were higher now. If they weren't careful, they could find themselves caught in something much larger and more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. And yet, there was no turning back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets as Ethan and Jake walked towards the small office building where the mysterious real estate holding company operated. It was tucked away in a forgotten part of town, a far cry from the sleek glass towers of corporate giants. The building was a faded gray structure, its windows partially obscured by blinds that had seen better days. Ethan's heart raced in his chest. The further they went, the more he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't just about Fitzgerald anymore. It was about something far bigger and far more dangerous. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, his voice low. "This is risky, man. What if we're walking straight into something we can't get out of?" Ethan's eyes were focused on the building ahead. "We don't have a choice. We need answers. If this is as big as we think it is, we can't just sit around waiting to be pulled deeper into it. We need to take control." Jake nodded, but his face remained tense, the uncertainty clear in his eyes. He wasn't entirely sure about this plan, but Ethan could see that his friend trusted him. Still, Jake wasn't one to rush into things without some kind of plan. They couldn't afford to be reckless, not when they were dealing with people who had the power to make things disappear. They reached the door to the building, a chipped glass pane reading Fitztech Holdings, LLC, in peeling gold lettering. Ethan pushed the door open, the faint chime of a bell echoing through the empty lobby. The air was cool, almost too cold, and the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. A worn receptionist desk stood by the entrance, but there was no one in sight. The sound of footsteps echoed from a hallway in the back, followed by a man's voice. "Can I help you?" Ethan turned and saw a tall man emerge from the hallway. He wore a tailored suit, but there was something off about him. His smile was too perfect, too rehearsed. His eyes, cold and calculating, didn't seem to match his welcoming demeanor. This was the type of man who'd been trained to read people, to see through facades, and Ethan immediately felt the prickling of danger. "We're looking for information about some land deals in the area," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. He didn't want to give too much away just yet. "We were hoping to speak to someone who could tell us more about Fitzgerald's property. You know, the one near the old park." The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem particularly surprised. "Fitzgerald, you say?" he repeated, stepping closer. "You'll want to speak to Mr. Marshall. He handles that sort of thing." "Great," Jake said quickly. "Where can we find him?" The man's smile widened. But Ethan could see the subtle tension in his jaw. "He's in the back. But before you go, may I ask what your interest is in Mr. Fitzgerald's property?" Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The question had been too casual, too innocent, but there was something in the man's tone that suggested he wasn't buying their story. Still, they couldn't back down now. "We're just curious about the neighborhood, that's all," Ethan said smoothly, offering a nonchalant shrug. "We've heard a lot about the area recently, and we thought we'd look into it." The man's eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment longer than necessary, and Ethan could feel the man assessing him, weighing his words. Finally, the man gave a short nod. "Very well," he said. "Right through that door. Mr. Marshall will be happy to speak with you." Ethan exchanged a glance with Jake before they both moved past the receptionist desk and through the door the man had pointed to. The hallway beyond was narrow and dimly lit, and they could hear muffled voices coming from further down. They were too far in to back out now. As they approached the door to the office, Jake whispered, "What if he knows something? What if he's in on this whole thing?" "We'll find out," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "Just stay calm and let me do the talking." The door opened with a soft click, and they stepped inside. Mr. Marshall's office was as cold and impersonal as the rest of the building. The walls were lined with shelves filled with leather-bound folders, all meticulously organized. A heavy oak desk sat at the center of the room, And behind it, a man in his mid-40s, with sharp features and a calculating gaze, looked up from a pile of paperwork. "You must be the young men inquiring about Fitzgerald's property," Mr. Marshall said, his voice smooth but edged with suspicion. "I trust you'll be quick with your business. We don't entertain much social chatter around here." Ethan smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Marshall. We just have a few questions about some recent transactions. We understand Fitzgerald has been involved in some land sales, and we wanted to know if there's any truth to that." Marshall's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Fitzgerald's property is none of your concern." His tone was sharp now, almost dismissive. "If you're looking to buy, I'd suggest you leave your information with my assistant, and we can go from there." Ethan didn't flinch. "We're not looking to buy," he said, leaning in just slightly. "We're just trying to understand what's going on. Why the sudden interest in Fitzgerald's land? Why the secrecy?" Marshall's eyes narrowed, and Ethan could feel the tension in the room thickening. "I think it's time for you to leave," Marshall said quietly, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. Jake, sensing the danger, stepped forward. "We're not going anywhere until you tell us what we want to know. This isn't just about land deals anymore, is it?" Marshall's face darkened, his smile vanishing entirely. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a creak. The air in the room felt suddenly colder, and Ethan's instincts screamed at him to get out, but he couldn't let go now. Not when they were so close. "You've made a grave mistake," Marshall said in a low voice. "There are things at play here that you don't understand, and people who don't understand are dangerous." Ethan took a step back, but his heart was pounding. Jake was right behind him, but neither of them dared to turn their back on Marshall. "Let's go, Ethan," Jake muttered, grabbing his arm, but Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing. Something was off. Marshall's words were laced with a warning, but there was more. He wasn't just protecting his company or his business interests. He was protecting something deeper. Before they could make their exit, a voice from the hallway interrupted. "Everything all right in there, Mr. Marshall?" The door swung open, and Ethan's breath caught in his chest. It was the man from the receptionist desk, but now there was something different about him. He was no longer the friendly face they'd seen earlier. His eyes were cold, almost predatory, and there was a hint of recognition in them as they locked onto Ethan. "We have a problem," Marshall said, his voice low but commanding. Ethan's mind raced. Who was this man? What were they dealing with? The trap had just snapped shut. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the door swung open and the man from the receptionist desk stepped into the room. His cold, calculating gaze fixed directly on Ethan, and there was no mistaking the shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick with tension, and Ethan felt the weight of danger pressing down on him. Marshall's voice broke through the thick silence. "You need to leave. Now." His tone had gone from dismissive to dangerously calm. Ethan's mind raced. There was no way he was walking out without some answers. If this man, this Mr. Marshall, was willing to go to such lengths to shut them down, then what they were investigating had to be more dangerous than they had realized. He exchanged a glance with Jake, who looked just as tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. But Ethan couldn't back down now. "We're not leaving until we know what's going on here," Ethan said, his voice steady, despite the rising panic in his chest. "We know something's off with these land deals. Fitzgerald's name keeps coming up, but it's not adding up." The man who had stepped into the room, Ethan could now see he was no ordinary receptionist, took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. There was something about his stance, the way he held himself, that screamed danger. He wasn't just an employee. He was someone in charge, someone with power. "You should have stayed away," the man said, his voice low and filled with menace. His gaze flickered briefly to Marshall, who gave a curt nod. The tension in the room grew unbearable as the man took another step closer. Ethan didn't flinch. He knew better than to show weakness in front of men like this. "You're digging in places you shouldn't," the man continued, his voice cold, almost detached. "People like you don't understand the forces you're up against. You think you're just chasing some land deals, but there's a lot more at stake here." Jake stepped back, clearly uneasy, but Ethan stood his ground. "What's at stake? Who are you people?" The man smirked, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. You'll find out soon enough, but it won't be easy, and it won't be safe. Ethan's mind spun. This was bigger than just some shady real estate deals. They were being warned off. No, threatened. But why? What was Fitzgerald's connection to this? And who were these people willing to go so far to keep them silent? Marshall's voice interrupted Ethan's thoughts. I suggest you listen to him, Mr. Carter. You've already crossed a line. There's no coming back from this. He stood from his desk, his posture more rigid than before, his eyes narrowing. You've been warned. Ethan could feel the walls closing in, and the urge to run, just turn and walk out, was overwhelming. But he refused to let fear dictate his actions. If he backed down now, they'd never get the answers they were seeking. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. What's going on with Fitzgerald's property? Why is it so important? Ethan demanded, his voice sharp. His pulse was racing, but his words were controlled. He had to know. For a long moment, Marshall said nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. It's not just land, Marshall said, his tone colder now, more dangerous. It's what's hidden beneath it that matters. The land itself is nothing. But what's under it, that's something worth protecting. Jake's eyes flickered with confusion, but Ethan's gut tightened. There was more. They were on the edge of something much darker than they had imagined. Hidden beneath it? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Marshall sighed as if the question was beneath him. You don't understand, and frankly, I don't have time to explain it to you. But make no mistake, if you keep going down this path, you'll regret it. This is bigger than you, bigger than Fitzgerald. It involves people with power you can't even begin to comprehend. The words hung in the air like a warning, but Ethan wasn't about to back down now. He had to know what Marshall meant. What was under the land that made it so valuable? What had Fitzgerald gotten involved in? Before Ethan could press further, the man who had entered the room, the receptionist, spoke again, his voice smooth but filled with a certain cold amusement. I think it's time you learn the hard way. Without warning, the door behind Ethan slammed shut. The sound of locks engaging echoed in the room, and Ethan's pulse spiked. They were trapped. What's going on? Jake hissed, taking a step toward the door, but the receptionist was already there, blocking the exit with a casual ease. Ethan's heart rate quickened. They were no longer just in a tight spot. They were in serious danger. Marshall's lips curled into a smile. I think you've overstayed your welcome. You'll regret this. But you'll also learn something valuable. Not all questions are meant to be answered. The receptionist stepped forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Ethan's instincts flared. This was it. He needed to make a move. They couldn't just sit here and wait to be taken down. But before either Ethan or Jake could react, there was a sudden burst of movement outside the office. The receptionist froze, his eyes narrowing. A voice came from the hallway, a voice Ethan recognized. Hey, what's going on in there? Marshall's expression flickered for the briefest moment, disbelief, followed by a hint of frustration. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Whoever was on the other side of the door was no ally to Marshall, and the shift was palpable. The receptionist straightened, his hand slowly retracting from his jacket as he looked at Marshall for direction. Get the door, Marshall ordered, his voice sharp. Ethan barely had time to react before the door was flung open, and in stepped another figure. This man was tall, dressed in an expensive suit, but there was an air of command about him that was different from Marshall's or the receptionist's cold demeanor. This man wasn't here to threaten. They were here to take control. I'm sorry, the man said with a thin smile, his eyes scanning Ethan and Jake with interest. I think we've all gotten a little ahead of ourselves. The tension in the room shifted again, this time to something far more ominous. The man who had entered the room stood tall, his presence demanding attention. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power, yet his demeanor was calm, almost too calm for the situation. He surveyed Ethan and Jake with an unsettlingly cool gaze, as though they were nothing more than nuisances in his otherwise controlled world. I'm afraid we need to have a little talk, he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. There was something about him that felt different from the others in the room. While Marshall and the receptionist had exuded an almost predatory coldness, this man carried an aura of dominance that sent a ripple of unease through Ethan. Ethan wasn't about to let himself be intimidated. He squared his shoulders, trying to match the man's gaze with one of his own, firm and unyielding. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tight with the weight of the situation. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on you two," he said, his eyes flickering briefly to Jake before returning to Ethan. "You've stumbled onto something far more complicated than you can possibly understand." Jake, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke, his voice laced with suspicion. "What's going on here? What does Fitzgerald have to do with all of this?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Fitzgerald, a man who believes he's in control. How quaint." He shook his head, as if mocking their naivety. Fitzgerald's property is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that many people, far more influential than him, have been working to piece together for decades. Ethan's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he still didn't understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. If Fitzgerald was merely a pawn, what kind of people were behind all of this? And what was this puzzle that spanned decades? The man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Ethan. "You think this is just about some land deals? Some shady business? No. What's buried beneath that land is something far more valuable, something that could shift the balance of power in ways you can't even begin to imagine." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What is it?" he asked, the question burning in his chest. "What's under the land?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "That's not something I'm going to tell you. Not yet. You've been poking around in areas you don't understand, but soon you'll see just how deep this goes. You'll see just how dangerous it is." Jake took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension in the room. "Who are you working for? Who's behind all of this?" The man's expression darkened, his smile slipping as he looked at Jake with a hint of amusement. "You think it's just one person? Just one group?" He laughed softly, a chilling sound that echoed in the silence. "This is bigger than you can possibly imagine. The people who are pulling the strings, they're not interested in land or money. They're interested in something much more powerful." Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had heard rumors of shadowy organizations that controlled the flow of power from the background, but he had never imagined he would be caught in the web of such a thing. And now, it seemed they were about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went. "Fitzgerald was just a tool," the man continued, his tone growing more serious. "But the real players, the ones who are going to decide the future of this city, of this country, they're watching, and they don't take kindly to people like you asking too many questions." Ethan's heart raced. This was no longer just about land deals or corrupt businessmen. This was something far larger, something political, something international. These people were part of a network that controlled more than just money. They controlled power itself. Before he could digest what the man was saying, the receptionist, who had been standing in the corner of the room, spoke up. His voice was sharp, impatient. "We're wasting time. You can't keep them here forever." The man's gaze flickered to the receptionist, then back to Ethan and Jake. For a moment, it seemed as though a silent conversation passed between them. Then, without another word, the man turned to the door and signaled for the receptionist to follow. "Come with me," the man said, his voice no longer as cold, but still commanding. "It's time you understood what's really going on. I'll show you exactly why you shouldn't have come here." Ethan exchanged a look with Jake, both of them unsure of what to do. Every instinct told him to run, to get out before things got worse. But something told him that running would only make things more dangerous. They were already in too deep. Reluctantly, Ethan nodded. "Lead the way." The man's smile returned, this time with a touch of something darker, more calculating. He opened the door and motioned for them to follow. As they stepped into the hallway, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the heart of something that was much bigger and more dangerous than anything they had anticipated. They followed him down a long corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. As they moved deeper into the building, Ethan couldn't help but feel that they were descending into something far darker than they had imagined. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them further into the heart of a hidden world, a world where power, corruption, and control were the driving forces. Finally, they arrived at a large, reinforced door. The man stopped in front of it and turned to face Ethan and Jake. "This is where you'll learn the truth," he said, his voice now taking on an almost reverent tone. "But be warned, some truths are far more dangerous than lies." With that, he unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a room that looked like it had been untouched for decades. Inside, there were piles of old files, maps, and documents scattered across the floor. At the far end of the room, there was a large table, and on it, a series of strange blueprints and drawings that made Ethan's stomach churn. Ethan stepped forward, his mind racing. He had no idea what he was looking at, but he could feel it in his bones. This was the heart of the conspiracy, the thing they had been chasing. And now, it was within their grasp. The man closed the door behind them, and for the first time, Ethan truly understood that there was no going back. The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy finality, and the room plunged into an eerie silence. The man, who had led them here, stood near the entrance, his face now hidden in the shadows. Ethan and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, both of them feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They were no longer just investigating land deals or trying to understand the intricacies of Fitzgerald's world. They had entered something far darker, far more dangerous. The room they were in was vast, lined with dusty shelves that were crammed with old files, maps, and blueprints. The air was thick with the smell of age, of forgotten things. But it wasn't the dust or the decay that caught Ethan's attention. It was the sense that they were standing in the heart of something monumental, something that had been buried for years, maybe decades. And now they were about to uncover it. The man slowly walked toward the large table at the center of the room, where the strange blueprints lay sprawled out in front of them. The table was covered with intricate drawings of buildings, city grids, and systems that Ethan couldn't quite place. There were marks on the blueprints, circles, lines, arrows, some of them in red ink, others in black, all connected in ways that didn't make sense to him. It was as though someone had mapped out a city, or perhaps even a network, but each connection was hidden beneath layers of secrecy. "What is all of this?" Jake whispered, his voice tinged with awe and suspicion. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood over the table, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the blueprint, as if contemplating whether or not to reveal the truth. The silence between them stretched on for a moment longer, and Ethan could feel the tension rising. He was starting to realize that they were in far over their heads. "These," the man finally said, his voice low and measured, "are the plans for something much bigger than you could ever imagine. This isn't just about land or money, or even control of an empire. It's about shaping the very future of the world. The people behind these plans, they're not interested in power for power's sake. No, they want something more, far more dangerous." Ethan stepped closer to the table, his curiosity getting the better of him. What are they trying to build? What's so important that they'd go to such lengths to hide it? The man's eyes flickered with a strange intensity. He leaned over the table, tracing a line with his finger, following it from one end of the blueprint to the other. These designs, they aren't just for buildings or cities. They're for a network, a global network that ties together governments, corporations, and key figures from all walks of life. People think they're controlling the world, but in reality, it's the people behind these plans who are pulling the strings. They've been laying the groundwork for decades, and now they're on the verge of making their move. Ethan's heart began to race. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but they were only raising more questions. This wasn't just about corporate corruption or shady dealings. This was a conspiracy of global proportions, something so far-reaching that it could change everything, and somewhere along the way, they had stumbled into it. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "Who's behind all of this?" The man's lips curled into a tight smile, but it wasn't a comforting one. That's the question, isn't it? The people behind this network, they don't operate in the open. They don't leave traces, don't leave fingerprints. They work through proxies, through organizations that have no idea they're being used. They pull the strings from the shadows behind closed doors, and they've been building this empire for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had always suspected that the world was controlled by forces beyond the average person's comprehension, but this was something else entirely. The implications of what the man was saying were mind-boggling. A global network of power, woven through governments, corporations, and influential individuals, all working toward a common goal that no one had yet fully understood. "What's their endgame?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes gleamed with a strange satisfaction. "That," he said, his voice almost reverent, "is the ultimate question. The answer? Well, that's something you're going to have to find out for yourselves." Ethan and Jake exchanged another look, their minds racing. They were so close now, so close to understanding the truth. But the truth was dangerous. It was too big, too complex. It wasn't something they could simply walk away from. The man stepped back from the table, his eyes shifting from Ethan to Jake. "You're already too deep in this," he said, his tone now laced with something almost sympathetic. "There's no turning back for you now. If you want to live, you'll have to keep digging, keep pushing. But be warned, you won't like what you find." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had known it, of course. Deep down, he had always known that this would be the point of no return. But hearing it from the man's lips, hearing it as a stark warning, made it feel more real than ever before. "Why are you telling us this?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. "If you're part of this, why are you helping us?" The man smiled again, this time without any malice. It was a simple, almost amused smile. "I'm not helping you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm giving you a choice. You can walk away right now, pretend you never saw any of this, and live your lives. Or you can keep digging, keep pushing, and face the consequences of what you uncover. The choice is yours." Ethan's mind was spinning. The choice was clear. There was no way they could walk away now, not when they were this close. But the price of uncovering the truth was already becoming painfully obvious. The man moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "I'll leave you with that to think about," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying a finality that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "But don't take too long. Time is running out." As the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan and Jake were left standing in the dimly lit room, surrounded by secrets that could change the course of history. The weight of what they had just learned pressed down on them, suffocating them with its enormity. But they both knew one thing for certain. They couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. They were in this to the end. The man's words lingered in the air like an ominous cloud, casting a shadow over Ethan and Jake as they stood in the dimly lit room. Every inch of their bodies felt heavy with the weight of the decision they had just made. There was no turning back now. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities, his thoughts tangled in a web of questions and fears. What had they just stumbled into? What would happen if they kept digging? He glanced at Jake, whose face was a mask of confusion and doubt, but there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that matched Ethan's own. They had no choice now but to go deeper. Ethan turned toward the blueprint on the table, his fingers tracing the intricate lines once more. The drawings seemed to mock him now, their complexity almost too much to bear. The network the man had described, an intricate web of power stretching across continents, unseen and untouchable, was unlike anything he had ever imagined. They were looking at something far beyond corporate conspiracies. This was a structure so deeply ingrained in the world that most people never saw it, never understood it. But now they did. And it terrified them. Jake spoke first, his voice breaking the silence. "What's our next move? We can't just sit here and wait. We need to find out who's really behind all of this." Ethan nodded, the urgency in Jake's voice pushing him to act. "We need to find connections, pull on the threads. If these people really control everything, we need to know who they are, how they're pulling the strings." The thought of it was overwhelming, but there was no other option. They had already crossed the line. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of a distant car engine revving to life. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Ethan's instincts flared, and he turned quickly, his heart pounding. "Someone's coming," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. Jake was already moving toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. "We need to get out of here. Fast." Without a word, they sprinted toward the back of the room, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Ethan's mind raced. Whoever was approaching knew they were here. Whoever had sent the man to warn them had likely anticipated this moment. The stakes had just gone up. They weren't just investigating a conspiracy anymore. They were being hunted. They reached the back door just as the sound of tires screeching against the pavement reverberated through the walls. Ethan pushed the door open, his heart hammering in his chest, and they slipped out into the alley behind the building. The cool night air hit them like a slap, but there was no time to savor the relief. They had to move. They ran, pushing themselves faster than they had ever run before, darting between shadows, moving with purpose. Every corner they turned, every alley they entered, felt like it might be the one where they'd be trapped, where their pursuers would close in on them. But they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. As they turned a corner, Ethan spotted a familiar black car parked on the side of the street, its engine idling. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. It was the same car that had been tailing them earlier in the day. They had been under surveillance the entire time. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him into a narrow doorway. They pressed themselves flat against the wall, holding their breath. The black car sped past them, its headlights cutting through the dark, but they didn't dare move until it was out of sight. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. This wasn't a simple investigation anymore. This was a race to uncover the truth before those who were trying to stop them could silence them for good. As the car disappeared into the distance, Ethan turned to Jake. "We need to get to the safe house. Now." Jake didn't hesitate. They both knew that staying in one place for too long was dangerous. The people behind this conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and if they wanted to stay alive, they had to stay ahead of them. They moved quickly through the streets, their steps careful and deliberate. Every few blocks, they stopped to check for any signs of being followed, but the streets seemed eerily empty. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, hunted. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a nondescript building on the edge of the city. A safe house, one that Ethan had used before in his previous work. It was secure, anonymous, and hidden in plain sight. They had no choice but to take refuge there while they figured out their next move. Once inside, Ethan slammed the door shut and locked it, then turned to face Jake, who was still breathing heavily from their escape. "We need to contact the others," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to know who's really behind this." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "But who do we trust? We don't know who's working with us and who's working against us." Ethan's eyes flickered with thought. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew they had to keep pushing. There were too many lives on the line now, not just theirs. The web of corruption they were tangled in reached far beyond them. For a moment, they stood in silence, the gravity of their situation settling in. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to move fast before the people after them closed in. "Let's get to work," Ethan said, determination flashing in his eyes. "We're going to take this down." And with that, they set to work, knowing that every step they took brought them closer to uncovering a truth that would shake the world to its core. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. They had no idea just how far they had already gone. The safe house was eerily quiet as Ethan and Jake huddled over their laptops, scanning through the information they had gathered. Time was running out. The people chasing them weren't just after answers. They were after their lives. Every click, every search felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. Ethan rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at his body, but the fear and adrenaline kept him from resting. Jake, equally tired but focused, leaned over the desk, squinting at the screen. The data they had uncovered in the last few hours was overwhelming. Names, connections, offshore accounts, and corporate ties that stretched across industries and governments. It was a spider's web of deceit, one that seemed to reach into every corner of the globe. But they were close. So close. Jake finally broke the silence. "Ethan, look at this." Ethan leaned over, his heart pounding as he saw the name on the screen. It was the same one from the blueprint, the one they had heard about from the man earlier. A name that kept resurfacing like a shadow in every piece of evidence. Harrison Crowley. Harrison Crowley was a name that commanded power. He was a billionaire with influence in almost every industry imaginable: finance, media, technology. His connections were vast, spanning continents and governments. If anyone had the ability to control the world from the shadows, it was Crowley. But Ethan never imagined how deep his reach truly went. "He's the one pulling the strings," Jake said, his voice tight with disbelief. "This whole operation, everything, he's behind it." Ethan's mind raced. Crowley was untouchable, a ghost who moved through the corridors of power without leaving a trace. How are they going to take him down? How could they even get close to someone like him? The question loomed over them like a cloud ready to burst. "We need to find a way to get to him," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't just sit here with all this information. We need leverage. We need something that can bring him down." Jake nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I know, but Crowley doesn't make mistakes. He's always 10 steps ahead. If we're going to beat him, we need to think bigger." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Every instinct in him told him that they were on the right track, but it felt like they were getting pulled deeper into a trap. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. And the people after them weren't just going to let them waltz in and take Crowley down. They had already made that clear. Suddenly, Ethan's phone buzzed, breaking the tension in the room. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. It was a secure message from an unknown contact. A string of letters and numbers, followed by a single sentence. "They know you're coming." His blood ran cold. Someone had tipped off Crowley's network. But who? And why? "Shit," Jake muttered, seeing the message over Ethan's shoulder. "They're onto us. How do they know?" Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. This was more than just surveillance. Someone had betrayed them, someone they trusted. "Did you tell anyone else about our progress?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "No, I didn't talk to anyone. Not since we left that building." Ethan's mind spun, replaying every moment since they'd started their investigation. He thought about the faces they had encountered, the people they had met. Who could have known they were onto something bigger than they initially realized? They needed to get ahead of this. If they didn't, they'd be caught in the crossfire. "Get ready," Ethan said, standing up and grabbing his bag. "We can't stay here. We're exposed. We need to move now." Jake didn't hesitate. They both knew that waiting around would only give Crowley's people more time to close in. They needed to leave the city, disappear, and figure out their next step from a safer distance. As they quickly packed up their things and checked their gear, Ethan's mind raced. They had the truth in their hands, but it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't going to be easy to expose it. Crowley wasn't just a man. He was a network, an empire of corruption that spanned the globe. And that meant they would have to go up against more than just his wealth and influence. They would be fighting an entire system designed to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. They moved through the dark streets of the city, half keeping their heads down and their steps swift. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passing car a reminder that they were being hunted. Ethan's mind raced as they turned a corner, moving toward a rendezvous point they had set up earlier. If anyone knew how to track Crowley's movements, it was Thomas, one of the few people Ethan trusted completely. When they reached the building, they found Thomas waiting for them in the shadows, his eyes scanning the surroundings. As soon as he saw them, he stepped forward, his expression tense. "They're closing in on you," Thomas said, his voice low. "I've been tracking their movements. You're not safe here." Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What have you found? Any leads on Crowley?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small tablet, swiping through it quickly. "Crowley's network is even more sophisticated than you imagined. I've traced some of his communications to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. He's got ties to government officials, corporate leaders, even law enforcement. It's going to take more than just evidence to take him down. You'll need allies and a hell of a lot of firepower." Jake shot Ethan a glance. Allies? We don't have the luxury of time for that. We need to act now. Ethan thought for a moment, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. You're right, but we can't do this alone. We need to hit him where it hurts. We need to find his weak points. Thomas nodded grimly. I know a guy who can help with that. He's ex-intelligence, knows how to get the kind of intel you need, but he's not easy to reach. If we're going to pull this off, we'll need to move fast and stay one step ahead. Ethan's mind clicked into place. If they were going to take down Harrison Crowley, they needed more than just evidence. They needed strategy. They needed the kind of access only people like Thomas had. And they needed to strike hard and fast before the man who controlled the shadows could shut them down for good. Let's go, Ethan said, determination in his voice. We have no time to waste. The chase was on, and this time there would be no turning back. The cold wind bit into their faces as Ethan, Jake, and Thomas navigated the narrow alleyways of the city. Every step felt like it brought them closer to something inevitable: danger, betrayal, and a confrontation with Harrison Crowley that they weren't sure they were prepared for. The weight of their mission settled over them like a heavy fog. They had little time, but they couldn't afford to rush into something they weren't fully ready for. Every decision they made now could be the difference between life and death. The rendezvous point was a dingy bar tucked away in the corner of a forgotten district. A place where people came to disappear, where secrets were exchanged under the cover of shadows. Ethan had been here before, years ago, when he was still working in the shadows of the intelligence world. Back then, it was a different life. Now, it was a refuge. They needed to meet someone who had the kind of information that could unravel Crowley's empire from the inside. Thomas led the way, his movements confident but cautious. The group made their way through the heavy, smoke-filled door, and Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The bar was nearly empty, save for a few patrons hunched over their drinks. At the far end of the room, sitting alone in a booth, was the person they had come to see: Elias Winters. Elias was a former intelligence operative, one of the few people who had managed to survive the cutthroat world of espionage. He was sharp, ruthless when necessary, but always practical. Ethan knew him well enough to trust him, but the question remained: would Elias be willing to help them after all these years? The trio made their way over to the booth, and Elias looked up, his cold, calculating eyes assessing them immediately. He didn't offer a handshake, just a brief nod. I'm assuming this isn't a social call, Elias said, his voice low and clipped. Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. We need intel on Harrison Crowley. We have the basics, but we need more. We need to know his weaknesses, his next moves. We need to take him down. Elias studied Ethan for a long moment before his lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Crowley, huh? You're aiming high, I'll give you that. He leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers on the table thoughtfully. You've heard the rumors, I'm sure. Crowley doesn't just control businesses. He controls people, governments, the global market itself. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous this becomes. It's not just a corporate takeover you're after, it's a war. Jake leaned forward, frustration evident in his posture. We're not here for your philosophy, Elias. We're here for the facts. Can you help us or not? Elias raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by Jake's tone. Easy there, soldier. I'm not your enemy. But you're right about one thing. You're not ready for this. Crowley's network is far-reaching. He's got people everywhere. If you're serious about taking him down, you'll need leverage. I can give you what you need, but it's going to come at a cost. Ethan felt the pit in his stomach tighten. Nothing came for free, not in this world. What's the cost? Elias's gaze flickered to Thomas, who stood silently behind them. Your friend there knows. I don't work for free, and I don't play nice. If you want information, you'll owe me a favor, and it won't be a simple one. Thomas nodded grimly, understanding the weight of Elias's words. I know the deal. We'll work out the details when the time comes. Ethan turned back to Elias. We don't have time for favors. We need to move fast. Crowley's people are already onto us. If you can't help us, we'll find someone who can. Elias shrugged, indifferent. You'll find plenty of people who will take your money, but no one will get close to Crowley without first understanding the game he's playing. You want leverage? I'll give you what you need, but you'll have to go deeper than you ever planned. You'll need to get into his inner circle. Ethan felt a chill run through him at the thought. Getting close to Harrison Crowley's inner circle wasn't just risky, it was a death sentence. Every person in that circle was either a loyal servant or a powerful ally of Crowley. Trusting any of them would be a mistake. But it was the only path forward. They had no choice. "What's the first step?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Elias's eyes gleamed with a dangerous knowledge. "First, you need to disappear. Crowley's people are already watching you. You can't just walk into his world and expect to waltz out again. We'll get you new identities, new faces. You'll need to become ghosts, and once you're in the system, once you've gained his trust, then we can start talking about taking him down." Jake clenched his fists. "You're telling us to hide in plain sight?" "Exactly," Elias replied. "You'll be ghosts in his operation. Only then will you be able to strike, and trust me, once you're in, there's no coming back. You'll either succeed or you'll vanish." Thomas glanced at Ethan, his expression unreadable. He's right. This is the only way. Ethan stared at Elias for a long moment, weighing the risks. Every part of him screamed to pull back, to stop and think things through. But the time for hesitation was long gone. The moment they had entered this game, they had sealed their fate. There was no turning back now. "We're in," Ethan said, his voice cold with resolve. "But we need everything you've got. No secrets." Elias smiled, an almost predatory grin. "Of course. I'll get you what you need. But remember this, Crowley plays for keeps. One wrong move, and you'll be nothing more than a footnote in his history. So make sure you're ready. And when the time comes, you'll need to be ruthless." Jake shot a glance at Ethan. "Ruthless is what we do best." Elias slid a small encrypted device across the table. "This will get you started. But remember, don't trust anyone. Not even me." Ethan pocketed the device, his mind already racing with plans and contingencies. The clock was ticking. Every minute they wasted brought them closer to exposure, closer to being caught in the web Crowley had spun around them. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how dangerous it became. As they stood to leave, Elias called out, his voice lowering to a whisper. "One last thing. Crowley's not just a businessman. He's got a plan, a bigger one. You're about to walk into something much more dangerous than you think. So when the time comes, don't say I didn't warn you." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Elias had given them the tools they needed, and now they were walking a razor-thin line between success and destruction. There was no turning back. The game had changed, and this time the stakes were life or death. The room was eerily quiet as Ethan, Jake, and Thomas sat around the table, their eyes glued to the encrypted device Elias had given them. The information it contained was their lifeline: maps, codes, access points, and names. Everything they needed to infiltrate Harrison Crowley's operation. But even with all the tools at their disposal, the reality of what lay ahead weighed heavily on their minds. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for control of a global empire, one whose foundation was built on manipulation, power, and ruthless ambition. They had spent days preparing, running through plans, rehearsing their roles, and getting lost in the web of lies and deception that had already ensnared them. They had to become ghosts, nothing more than whispers in the dark, unnoticed and undetected, blending seamlessly into Crowley's network. But every decision, every move they made had to be calculated with precision. One slip-up, and everything would come crashing down. The team had split up for the final phase of their plan. Thomas was in charge of securing the identities they needed, using his connections in the underground world of fake documents and black market services. Jake was tasked with hacking into Crowley's private databases, getting them the information they needed about his inner circle and his next moves. And Ethan? Ethan was the key. He had to get close to Crowley himself, to earn his trust and gain access to the heart of the empire. He would have to walk a fine line between appearing useful to Crowley and not becoming a target of his ruthless mind. It wasn't just the corporate world that they had to infiltrate. It was Crowley's personal life. He had secrets, dark ones, hidden behind the perfect facade of his empire. Crowley didn't trust easily, and neither did his inner circle. Ethan knew this would be the hardest part. Crowley's people were always watching, always waiting for someone to make a mistake. The only way to get inside was to outplay them. The first step was a bold move. Ethan used the new identity they had forged. Nathaniel Holt, a tech mogul from Silicon Valley with a reputation for making high-stakes business deals. He had no past, no ties, and no one who would come looking for him if he disappeared. He was a clean slate, perfect for slipping into the world Crowley had built. The next step was simple. Get invited to one of Crowley's exclusive parties. It wasn't easy. Crowley's events were tightly controlled, reserved for the ultra-wealthy, the powerful, and the influential. Invitations were limited, and they didn't just go to anyone. But Ethan knew exactly how to play the game. A little bribery, a well-placed recommendation from an anonymous source, and a convincing backstory later, and he was in. The night of the event, Ethan donned a sharp, tailored suit, his appearance polished to perfection. Every movement was calculated, every word spoken with purpose. He had studied Crowley's mannerisms, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. Tonight, Ethan had to blend in. Tonight, he had to become part of the machine. The venue was a sprawling mansion perched high on a hill, overlooking the city lights like a beacon of power and excess. The guests were all the same. Rich, polished, and insufferably smug. Crowley's world, a playground for the elite. But beneath the surface of wealth and opulence was a ruthless undercurrent, a world where loyalty was bought and sold, and betrayal lurked in every corner. Ethan scanned the crowd, his eyes locking onto the man he had come for, Harrison Crowley. He stood by the grand staircase, surrounded by a few key figures from his inner circle. His icy blue eyes scanned the room, always calculating, always assessing. Ethan felt the familiar chill run down his spine. This was the man who controlled everything, the man who had nearly destroyed them all. Ethan's heart raced, but his face remained impassive. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He was in the lion's den, and he had to survive. The evening wore on, and Ethan gradually worked his way through the crowd, mingling with important guests, making himself known. He watched Crowley carefully, noting his interactions with others, the subtle power dynamics at play. Crowley wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator. Every word he spoke was calculated, every gesture deliberate. Ethan knew that he needed to gain his trust to appear useful, even disposable, in the grand scheme of things. It was the only way in. As the night grew late, Ethan found himself standing at the bar, casually sipping a glass of champagne. He glanced around, keeping an eye on the key players, but it was Crowley's right-hand man, Gabriel, who caught his attention. Gabriel was a formidable presence, sharp, calculating, and fiercely loyal to Crowley. He was known for his ruthlessness, and Ethan knew that if he was going to make it inside, Gabriel was the person he had to win over. Ethan approached him, his steps measured and deliberate. Gabriel looked up, his eyes narrowing as he sized Ethan up. For a moment, there was silence, but then Gabriel spoke. "You're new here," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "What's your angle?" Ethan smiled, keeping his tone friendly but guarded. "I'm just a businessman, looking to expand my horizons. I've heard a lot about Mr. Crowley and his influence. Thought it might be worth a conversation." Gabriel studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "Crowley doesn't just invite anyone into his world. You must have something impressive to offer." Ethan's mind raced. This was the moment he had been preparing for. "I'm not looking for anything, just an opportunity to collaborate. I have access to resources that could be useful to Mr. Crowley. I'd be more than happy to prove my worth." Gabriel's eyes flickered with interest. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning his attention back to the rest of the room. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Gabriel was intrigued. That was the opening Ethan needed. The night dragged on, but Ethan didn't let his guard down. Every conversation, every encounter was a test. He had to be careful. One wrong move, one wrong word, and it would all be over. But he knew he was getting closer. Crowley was still watching, and he had to be ready for when the moment came. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, an unexpected opportunity arose. Crowley's voice echoed through the room as he announced that the evening's festivities were about to take a more private turn. Ethan's heart raced. This was it. Crowley was about to reveal something important. He needed to be there, in that room, when the secrets were laid bare. He moved swiftly, making his way through the maze of guests, slipping past security, and into the private study where Crowley had retreated. The door clicked shut behind him, and there, standing in front of the massive desk, was Harrison Crowley himself. Well, well, Crowley said, a slow smile spreading across his face. You've managed to get my attention. But what now? Ethan felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This was the confrontation, the point of no return. He knew that everything had led to this one instant. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Now, Mr. Crowley, we get down to business. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city below, the lights of the skyline twinkling like distant stars. Ethan stood across from Harrison Crowley, a cold, calculating smile on his face. The game had been long and hard, but they were now both on the edge of the same precipice. There was no turning back. Crowley leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "You've done well to get this far, Holt," he said, his voice low but filled with a dangerous respect. "But there's always a price to pay when you play with fire." Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile, his posture unwavering. "I didn't come here to play with fire, Crowley. I came here to end it." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of their unspoken understanding. Both men had built their empires on deception, manipulation, and power. But now, the rules had changed. This wasn't just about business. It was about survival, control, and who would reign supreme in the end. Ethan had spent years studying Crowley, understanding his methods, his weaknesses. He knew Crowley's greatest fear wasn't losing money or power. It was losing control. And that was exactly what Ethan had come to do. Take control, dismantle the empire piece by piece, and leave Crowley powerless, just like everyone else he had crushed in his relentless pursuit of dominance. "You think you can take everything I've built?" Crowley finally asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "You think you can just walk in and destroy me? There's no room for weakness in this world, Holt." Ethan's smile faded, his eyes steely with resolve. "I'm not here to destroy you, Crowley. I'm here to expose the truth. You've hidden behind lies for too long, and it's time for the world to see who you really are. It's time for your empire to crumble." The words hung heavy in the air, the final declaration of war. But Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but the first strike had been made. And as Crowley's expression shifted from disbelief to fury, Ethan knew that his plan had worked. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now it was only a matter of time before everything would fall apart. The shadows of the room seemed to grow longer, the weight of their past actions bearing down on them. Ethan had fought his way to this point, and though the outcome was still uncertain, one thing was clear. The world was about to change. Crowley's reign would end, and a new era was dawning, one built on truth, integrity, and the strength of those who had refused to be crushed. As Ethan turned to leave, the door clicking shut behind him, he knew that the final game had only just begun. But he was ready. No matter what it took, he would win. The empire would fall. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this heartwarming story. We hope it inspired you as much as it did us. Acts of kindness, like the one in this video, remind us all of the power we have to make a difference in someone's life. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Your support helps us bring more real-life heroes and incredible moments to you. Stay kind, stay safe, and remember, you can make a difference too.